League of Women Voters of Colorado Climate Emergency Task Force September meeting. My name is Sandy Schuster. We are a group of members from all over Colorado who realize what a threat the environmental degradation of our planet is to all life on Earth. We decided to organize in 2018 by declaring an emergency with the mandate to educate our citizens and lawmakers about this threat. The COVID epidemic slowed us down, but the ability to use Zoom was a big asset in bringing members from all over the state without the carbon footprint and difficulty of travel. We have members from League of Women Voters chapters from Weld County, Estes Park, Durango, Front Range counties, Alamosa, Larimer County, and many other places. To say that today's program is one that people are interested in is an understatement, considering that we have over 60 people registered for the meeting. Carbon capture is becoming one of the most talked about subjects in environmental circles. There are numerous articles, both pro and con, and we are here today to learn more, not debate, so that we can approach the subject with as much knowledge as possible. A couple of announcements before we start. Next month on October 19th, our presentation will be by an organization called Green America, and it's about restorative agriculture. And as you can see in both of these presentations, that we're talking about turning things around to mitigate the damage we have done. We're not just interested in stopping the continuing damage, but we want to reverse some of the effects of too much carbon in the atmosphere. But how are we going to do it in the best possible way? In November, we will have Colorado legislators tell us what environmental legislation they're planning to introduce and or support in the legislature this year. We need your help to recruit legislators from all around the state. We want members from the rural communities as well as the Front Range and larger cities. So ask your legislator if they would be willing to share their plans with us on November 16th at 4 p.m. We have at least one legislator committed so far, thanks to Ann Sutton, a member in Adams County. Future presentations will include plastics, air quality, water, and legislation 2024. Our speakers today are from the Rocky Mountain Institute, a prestigious organization at the forefront of environmental education and policy for many years. I will turn the program over to them to introduce themselves and tell us about RMI and their ideas about how to fight this climate emergency. Please stay on mute during the presentation and put any questions you would like to ask in the chat box to be addressed at the end. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. Thank you to all the people who helped put this program together, including the League of Women Voters Colorado office staff. This work takes a village. The steering committee is Pat Messick, Maggie Markey, Ann Sutton, Sandy Vandehay, Gail Barlow, Alice Ramsey, Elaine Rideout, Barbara Dungy, and me. If you have any suggestions or questions, please contact one of us. So take it away, Peter, Rudy, and Kyle.
Thank you, Sandy. Oh, Rudy, I was just going to introduce you and then let you run with it, if that's all right.
Sounds good.
But many of you are familiar with RMI, so I'll keep the introduction short, but we are a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to the renewable energy transition. And as part of that work, we've begun working on carbon dioxide removal and storage. And so I'll just pass it over to Rudy Kashar, who's a manager on our Climate Aligned Industries team, and Kyle Clark Sutton, who's a manager on our US program, to really dive in and then have a dialogue after their presentation.
Great, thanks, Peter. And thank you to all of you for having us here today. Kyle and I are really excited to be here and just share a little bit of an overview of some of the things we're working on and why we think it's important. I think before I share screen and start talking through things, maybe we'll just do a brief intro of me and Kyle so you know who we are. So as Peter said, I'm a manager on our Climate Aligned Industries team. I'm actually here in Boulder today, and I've been with RMI for about 3 years now. I did an undergrad degree in chemical engineering, and then I did my PhD at CU Boulder in chemical engineering. So I've been in Colorado a long time and love the state, and really excited about what's happening with carbon management in the state. Kyle, do you want to give a brief intro?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, thank you all for having us today, and thank you for your work advocating for strong climate policy. I'm like Peter said, I'm a manager in the U.S. program at RMI, and the U.S. program is sort of our in-house policy shop, and we collaborate with other programs that focus on specific sectors to advance policy at the state and national level. And I lead our industrial decarbonization projects as well as the carbon dioxide removal policy work stream, and work closely with Rudy on that. So glad to be here.
Great, thanks, Kyle. I just shared my screen. Can you all see this? Yep.
Yes, we can.
Great.
Sorry, I was muted.
No, that's okay. Great. So, like I said, we've prepared, Kyle and I have prepared a few slides here to take you all through some of what we're working on. I think what we'd like to do is kind of tag team this. I'll start us off and take us through sort of, what is carbon dioxide removal? What's the role of CDR in the overall climate question? And then Kyle will take us through some of the specifics in terms of what's going on in the policy space with CDR, and then what's going on in the state of Colorado. So to kick us off, I think when I'm talking about carbon management, I run into a lot of different people who have different degrees of familiarity with the term and kind of where it fits into the climate conversation. So to kind of kick us off here, I've just made a very simple chart. In the process of mitigating emissions related to climate change related emissions, we might think about decarbonization as like the biggest sort of category of what we can do to mitigate the impacts of climate change. Within that is carbon management, which is sort of like how we deal with CO2 especially. And then there's two things that we can do with carbon dioxide. One of them is carbon dioxide removal, which is where we take CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in a permanent way. And the other is carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture utilization and sequestration, or storage. And these are processes that actually take CO2 from a point source before it gets into the atmosphere. So the big difference between these two carbon management approaches is that the one on the right is basically taking the CO2 out of a smokestack or out of an industrial process before it can ever get into the atmosphere. And the one on the left, and that's the one that Kyle and I are really focused on, is actually taking CO2 out of the atmosphere once it's been put up there. Okay, so a little more on carbon dioxide removal. So this is just a chart here that I created from the IPCC scenario database. So the IPCC, you probably all know, right? This is like the major international body of scientists that come together and think about sort of what's going on in a climate sort of perspective globally, the best scientific research, what's happening, what we should potentially do about it. And they put together these scenarios that look at emissions trajectories from today out into the future, out to 2100. And what this is showing basically, we have here, in a 1.5C aligned scenario, hopefully peaking of yearly emissions of CO2, and then a decline in the yearly emissions down into a net negative space out into the second half of the century, where we're actually drawing down emissions that were released previously, right, to take us back, to where we were before we started emitting all of this CO2. The other thing that carbon dioxide removal can do is actually take up sort of residual emissions that are from hard to abate sectors. So there might be some types of emissions, like from airplanes or things like that, that are really hard to completely eliminate. And so we might need some carbon dioxide removal to still take those out. So both carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal are both important. So again, CCS, carbon capture, this is essentially mitigating waste at the source. So taking it from the smokestack And that's going to be really helpful in this sort of near term for bringing down this really steep curve of emissions. Carbon dioxide removal, by contrast, can be used in two ways, right? So I call it retroactive waste cleanup. It's sort of like cleaning up the CO2 that was put in the atmosphere in the past. And then again, the sort of like hard to abate emissions, or the residual emissions from sectors that continue to emit. One of the ways, the analogies I like to use to explain the scale of this challenge is to compare it to the waste industry. So if we start here on the left, if you look at all municipal solid waste production globally, it's about 2.1 gigatons per year, right? So this is like all the trash that all the people put out on their curb added up over the course of a year. It's about 2.1 gigatons, right? And a gigaton, by the way, is a billion tons. So that's a lot of waste, right? If you were to add up all of the CO2 emissions, it's actually about 36 gigatons per year. So, you know, really quite a bit bigger than the total amount of municipal solid waste that we generate. If you look at what the IPCC says we need to remove in the future, 2030, 2040, 2050, out to 2100, these numbers get quite big, right? And the reason that they are so big is partially we need to suck up past emissions, but we also need to mitigate emissions that are still going into the atmosphere. To put this all in perspective, these are the largest commodities that humans deal with on planet Earth today, right? And no surprise that the biggest ones there are some of the fossil fuels that are actually creating the CO2. But just to put this kind of in perspective, there's really nothing that we've ever done on the scale that, you know, is the IPCC says we're going to need for carbon dioxide removal in the future. So it's really a very pressing, unprecedented challenge. Within our team on carbon dioxide removal, we've identified about 30 different ways that we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And I think the summary here, if you kind of look at this, and it's a lot of information, there's a lot of ways that you can take CO2 out of the atmosphere. We've divided this into these first three buckets: biogenic, geochemical, and synthetic CDR, and then a final bucket, which is just storage of CO2. So looking at these first three, I think the way that I typically characterize them is the first bucket is plants, the second one is rocks, and the third one is sort of machines. And so all of these major buckets are ways that we can take CO2 out of the atmosphere. They all have advantages and disadvantages. I'm glad to answer any questions about those. I think one of the things to highlight about the first bucket, and this is always kind of the, exciting sort of like punchline, when you first start talking about carbon dioxide removal, is that plants have been doing carbon dioxide removal for billions of years, right? It's how plants grow. It's how photosynthesis works. So if we can capture that as a process, that's a way that we can, draw down CO2 from the atmosphere. In the second bucket, geochemical CDR, this is actually also something that the Earth has been doing naturally for billions of years. It's part of what's called the silicate carbonate cycle. And what essentially happens here, you all may have seen like the cliffs of Dover, right? They have these like very white cliffs. And there's natural minerals in Oman as well, and around the world, basaltic rocks, that will actually react with CO2 to form solid carbonate minerals. So it's basically one type of rock reacting with CO2 to form another type of rock. And then the CO2 is completely secure and won't go back into the atmosphere until it's, taken into the Earth and emitted through a volcano. So pretty secure storage there. And then synthetic CDR, these are approaches where you all might be familiar with, where you're using machines like direct air capture. So just a little, taste of some of these. So I've picked an example company from each of those three buckets. The first one here from biogenic CDR, the second one from geochemical, and the third from the synthetic CDR category. So the first one, Charm Industrial, this is a company that actually has operations in Colorado. And what they're doing is they're taking agriculture waste and doing a process called pyrolysis, where you heat that waste in the absence of oxygen, and it breaks down the biomass material into a kind of like liquid slushy slurry that they then inject down into the ground, where it's stable and secure. A company that's doing geochemical CDR is Project Vesta. They're putting a type of rock called olivine on beaches. And this is a natural occurring rock that will react with CO2, as I was saying earlier, and will take that CO2 out of the atmosphere and store it in a permanent way. And then this last one, maybe you all have seen some pictures from direct air capture facilities. This is a picture from Climeworks, their Orca facility in Iceland. So this is a direct air capture facility, right? So this is like a machine that has fans that push air through a sorbent material that absorbs CO2, and then they can take that CO2 out and inject it underground. So those are really the three big buckets. The one thing before passing it over to Kyle that I just want to emphasize, and this is something we take very seriously on our team. And I think that, it's something that across the space of research that's currently happening on carbon dioxide removal, that everyone is really quite aligned on, is that carbon dioxide removal is something that we see as necessary, but not sufficient to hitting our long-term climate goals, right? So the way of saying that maybe in a little more detail is to say, we need CDR if we're going to hit our long-term climate goals, but it is not going to be enough. We still need to do all of the mitigation, associated with the energy transition. This is things like energy efficiency, clean electricity, electrification of devices, decarbonization generally, including CCS. All of that is going to be important, as well as having CDR. So, I think that's a major concern of ours, because there are people who will say, well, if you can just clean up the trash later, why should we worry? And what I would tell you is the scale of the trash removal, as I showed you all on one of my first slides, is so large that if we don't start mitigating the trash that we're putting up there, that it's going to be too much to clean up later. So I'll pass it to Kyle here to talk about some policy.
Thanks, Rudy. I don't know if you all have ever seen the movie WALL-E, but that just came to mind for me, with trash covering planet Earth. I see some good questions already in the chat. Please do keep them coming and we'll get to them. Our goal is to hopefully be done talking around the half hour so we can have some lengthy conversation. So one of the things, sort of as context, just to set the context, the federal government has started to invest quite a bit in carbon dioxide removal, and they're investing along sort of several pathways, both research and development, as well as supporting pilot scale and demonstration scale projects, and also supporting the production of carbon dioxide removal through tax credits. And so I won't go over every single pocket of funding because that would take a little while, but I think the two big ones that you all might have heard of in recent past is, first is something called the 45Q carbon oxide sequestration tax credit. And basically what that is a tax credit to companies that either use CCS to capture emissions at the source, or direct air capture specifically, not all the kinds of carbon dioxide removal that Rudy mentioned, but direct air capture specifically to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And the highest level of incentive goes to companies that use direct air capture to capture CO2 and then sequester it geologically in sort of a permanent way. And then there are different tiers of incentives for doing carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and utilization, and things like that. And then the second one that you all may have heard of is the Department of Energy has a program called the Direct Air Capture Hub program. And just a couple months ago, the DOE announced their first round of awards. So they announced $1.2 billion and awards to different projects, one of which was in Colorado, and we'll talk about a little bit. But all that to say, there is a lot happening at the federal level that's influencing sort of the process, both on the research and development side, but also to incentivize real projects to get off the ground. And in general, at the national and state level, policy is going to be really critical in ensuring that carbon dioxide removal scales up, because there's very little inherent demand for carbon dioxide, right? We put a lot of it out into the air, but there's not many incentives to pull a lot of it out of the air, in part because we don't have the same level of regulations or carrots, not carrots, sticks, as other countries do, like the European Union, where they have emissions caps, and carbon dioxide removal is sort of recognized as going to play a role in meeting those legally binding targets. So policy is going to be really critical for creating the market, but also funding the early stage R&D and demonstration projects. And we think there are 4 key areas that policy is going to be really important. The first is regulatory certainty. So this area of technology and science is relatively new, and thinking through how it gets integrated into our industries and into agriculture and into our energy systems is complicated. And there are rules in place that can slow things down, which can sometimes be a good thing, but also can slow things down without really resulting in a better outcome. And so we're going to need rules and regulations that help to ensure that carbon dioxide removal projects can get off the ground and can get permitted and built, but built in a way that's responsible and engages with host communities, and creates benefits for communities. The second area is research, development, and deployment. There is a lot that we don't know yet. Rudy mentioned 28 different, or almost 30 different approaches to carbon dioxide removal. I think it's safe to say that RMI probably has the most comprehensive inventory of approaches. And I don't know if Rudy would say that himself, because he's the one who's leading that project, and he's a humble guy, but I think it's probably a fair statement. And so this space is complicated, and a lot of these things some of them are taking old ideas and applying them in new ways. But a lot of them are brand new technologies that we don't know yet if they'll work at scale, and if they'll work at a price that we can afford. And so we need the government to fund RD&D. Third, government-backed markets. So we're going to need a significant amount of money to both create the supply, and that's where things like the direct air capture hubs program comes in, and the 45Q tax credit comes in. But we're also going to need to create the demand, whether it's through requiring industries to procure carbon dioxide removal to offset some of their emissions as they continue to draw them down, or if it comes in the form of the government itself purchasing carbon dioxide removal to sort of stimulate the market. That's going to be an important role. And then finally, just and equitable deployment. We've learned over decades that without strong guardrails and strong sort of expectations set up front for industrial scale projects, communities are often left behind and are often harmed in the process of standing up new industries or new projects. And so we need to do it right this time. And really, we believe the climate depends on it, because if we don't approach this in the right way and do it in partnership with communities, we could easily, see this industry, fail to move at the pace that it's needed. You can go to the next slide, Rudy. So now we're just going to step down into the Colorado context a little bit and talk a little bit about what's going on here. Next slide. So first of all, Colorado is an attractive place for carbon dioxide removal, research, development, and deployment. And I should also say for carbon capture as well. And the state is actively pursuing both. And you all are likely very aware of that, but the state views both carbon capture and carbon dioxide removal as an important part of their toolbox. So a few of the things that make Colorado a good place for these types of industries are first, growing clean electricity supply. Some of these processes, especially direct air capture, but several of the other many of the CDR approaches require a large amounts of energy. And if we're using that energy to pull carbon dioxide out of the sky, we certainly don't want to put a bunch of carbon dioxide back in the process, right? So using clean energy to power those processes wherever we can is really important. And Colorado has supportive policy in place that is forcing the state in that direction. And I'm sure we could debate about if it's forcing it fast enough or things like that. But compared to other states, it's certainly moving in the right direction faster than many other states. In general, too, the state has strong legislated climate action in terms of binding legislation that pushes the state to implement policies across all sectors to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And because of that sort of forcing function, the state is really looking at every tool in the toolbox, and so carbon management is on their radar. The state also has good geology for carbon storage, and so Colorado is home to a lot of oil and gas. That's one of the things that where you find good oil and gas reserves, usually you find the geology that you need to store carbon dioxide as well, and so that's a strong point in favor of what we call closed system CDR approaches, where the process results in a stream of carbon dioxide that you can physically sequester into a well, as opposed to say a geochemical process like Rudy was mentioning, where you might be spreading sand, a rock onto a beach or something like that, which is more like an open system. Fourth, Colorado has a really complementary workforce. And what I mean by that is particularly oil and gas, but also industry at large workforce have very relevant skills for industrial scale carbon management. And they're going to need jobs as the oil and gas industry declines over time. And then finally, you all know that Colorado has really top-notch academics and research institutes that focus on these types of issues, everything from NREL to Colorado School of Mines and others. Rudy mentioned Charm Industrial. That's a bio-oil CDR company that is based in Colorado. The other larger sort of CDR startup that is in Colorado is called Global Thermostat, and they have a direct air capture facility that's currently capturing, or is the target is to capture 1,000 tons per year. That's not that much, but for this early stage of the industry, it's actually a pretty good size. And then another company that is operating in Colorado is called Carbon America. They are a storage company, so they partner with companies that either do CCS or do direct air capture to actually store the carbon. And they're actually one of the consortium members of a consortium that is led by the University of Illinois, but is based in Colorado, and recently was awarded a few $1 million from the Department of Energy to do a feasibility study for a direct air capture hub. Now, this is just a feasibility study, so it's in the very early stages, and it'll be many years before there's any real infrastructure built, likely. But but that is one of the hubs that was awarded funding through the Department of Energy in the recent Direct Air Capture Hub Awards. Rudy, you can go to the next slide. On the policy front, Colorado is actively working to scale carbon management. So these are just a few of the recent either publications or pieces of legislation that have come out. So last year, Colorado published the Carbon Sequestration Framework, which is a legislative proposal. It's essentially sort of a review of all of the regulations and policies that are in place now that will either facilitate or present challenges to scaling carbon sequestration in the state. And so this is actually, they have a summary section. So if you're interested, I think it's a pretty accessible primer. I might not be the best judge of that, but it's pretty accessible in terms of giving a sense of the regulations that have an impact on carbon storage in the state. And it specifically is looking at community involvement, advanced planning, how to do it in a way that's sort of managed in terms of the infrastructure that's needed, and results in sort of smart build out of infrastructure, and also results in sort of the ability to move more quickly while still doing it in a responsible way. Last year, the Colorado House also passed, or Colorado legislature passed House Bill 23-1210, which was just called Carbon Management. And that bill does two things. It makes sure that carbon management projects have access to the Industrial and Manufacturing Operations Clean Air Grant Program. And that's specifically focused on carbon management projects that are storing carbon for at least 100 years. It also directs the Colorado Energy Office to develop a carbon management roadmap. And that's essentially to look at the opportunity for scaling carbon capture and storage, as well as carbon dioxide removal in the state, and make policy recommendations for both growing the industry, but also doing it with the appropriate guardrails to ensure that public interest is protected. And by public interest, I mean public health, but also considerations for impacted communities and things like that. And then lastly, last year, the Colorado legislature passed House Bill 23-1069, and that was to study something called biochar in plugging of oil and gas wells. At a very high level, it creates an advisory group related to use of biochar in plugging oil and gas wells, and it also directs Colorado State University to conduct a series of studies and lab research to assess whether pilot projects would be warranted. And so biochar, and Rudy will correct me if I butcher anything, but biochar is essentially taking biomass and using pyrolysis to result in a, rather than bio oil, which is a liquid product, it's a solid carbon product that you can then store in a variety of ways. And one of the proposals is to use all of those retired, expired oil and gas wells as a storage mechanism for biochar to both reduce fugitive emissions coming from those oil and gas wells. So there's methane coming out of those old wells a lot of times. And so if you stick biochar down in it and then you plug it and monitor it over time, that can have multiple benefits. So those are just a few things that are happening at the state level. Next slide, Rudy. I realize I'm over time, so just really quickly, to wrap up, carbon management is going to be a really important tool in our toolbox. We can't achieve our targets without them. But as Rudy mentioned, we have to aggressively reduce our emissions and dodge the moral hazard of basically giving ourselves license to continue polluting. This is largely a policy challenge that can be addressed by establishing guardrails for how carbon removal is used and developed. We need to start today because these technologies are nascent. The scale that we need is huge, unprecedented, and it's going to take us time to get the technologies right and get them to the price that we need them to be so that we can do them at scale. And starting today also gives us time to do it right and work with communities that are going to host these projects to ensure that the projects are designed in a way that benefits them rather than harms them. There's a lot that we don't know. A lot more research and development is needed. And the approaches that are thought to be the best ones today, we may find in a few years are not the best ones because we may have discovered something new, or we may have developed whole new ways of doing things. And then lastly, there's good and bad ways to do everything. And so there are definitely bad ways we can go about doing this. But if we can put guardrails in place and establish high standards for project development, we can deploy these projects in partnership with communities in a way that will benefit communities. That's all we have. So we'd love to open it for questions now. And
the first question that was brought up was Alice wanted to know how much energy it takes to produce pyrolysis. And would you talk about that a little bit more? I heard about a plant in Weld County that they were talking about opening, and people were pretty upset.
Yeah, one of the simplest ways to kind of, say how much energy it takes and then also how much CO2 it re-releases is it takes about half of the biomass to turn the other half into biochar. So the way that you would do this is you would power the process with the combustion of some of that biomass.
And do you know anything about the plant?
I don't know anything about the specific plant. Do you know what the objections were to it?
I'm not sure that they know what pyrolysis is.
Oh. Yeah, so in a sense, like it's actually a quite simple process, and it's done all over the world already. And one of the cool things about it, it's actually how you make charcoal. So charcoal is essentially like a charred form of biomass. So what you would do is, take, let's say, like woody biomass. So maybe this would be, logs or something like that. And you heat it by burning some of those logs in a sealed container. And when you do that, maybe you all have seen this, like when you have a fire and you get like embers, if you were to contain that fire, so it was starved of oxygen, what will actually happen is the carbon will be left behind and turn into a charred substance called biochar. And then that obviously is black and it will have a lot of carbon in it. Some of the carbon will be released, but what's left will be in a more stable form. And you can store that or put it on fields or do other things with it.
Oh, that's very helpful. I didn't know that pyrolysis was the same as biochar. Okay, so you're creating biochar with pyrolysis.
That's right.
Okay. Does the liquid carbon dioxide from farm waste, the one that they put back in the dirt, is it likely to escape back into the atmosphere?
Yeah, so in that case, so with pyrolysis is just a fancy term that means heating something that can burn with not enough oxygen. And so you don't let it burn all the way. And depending on how hot you make it and how long you keep it hot, you either get biochar, which is a solid, or you get bio oil, which is a liquid. So it's kind of like the temperature and process conditions that determine whether you get the solid or liquid. So in the case of Charm Industrial that both Kyle and I mentioned, what they're doing is they're taking waste corn stover, so waste from like, cornfields, and they're doing a version of the process that produces liquid. They're injecting that, I don't know the actual depth, but it's not as deep as like an oil and gas well, but it's still fairly deep. And the oil that they make is actually like 50% water, and then it's a bunch of other sort of like soluble organic compounds. I'm trying to think of an example of something that you all will have experienced. It actually kind of smells a bit good. It's sort of like when you have like a nice fire and it has like a nice smell to it. It's sort of just like a charred version of biomass. In terms of escaping, I don't think there's any questions in the community about that happening. Essentially, they're putting this liquid mixture down there, and once the water that's in it, sort of, which is the water left over from the plants, once that kind of seeps into the ground, all you're left with is a kind of like plant paste that's kind of left under the ground.
Okay.
I think in a lot of cases, it's not likely to escape on its own, but the biggest concerns about something like that is if it's done, basically if it comes into contact with the water table, that can result in harm to the like drinking water supply. I will say it's not out of the question. Obviously, those types of things have happened before. However, the oil and gas industry, so industry at large, does have a lot of experience with storing things underground. Now that's not to say, again, that mistakes haven't been made. So certainly regulation and really strong monitoring requirements are going to be really important to make sure that this is done safely.
Now, that was one of the next questions, is how will the efficiency and effectiveness of the processes be measured? There's probably a lot of different ways, right?
Yeah, so with all of the approaches that we showed, and I can tab back to these just so that we have them here. With all of these different approaches, they all have different constraints and different challenges, right? So some of them, the ones over here in the synthetic branch, right? So this is like direct air capture where I showed with the machines. In this case, you're capturing a stream of carbon dioxide, and it's actually pretty easy to put a flow meter on that and know how much CO2 you have and that you're sequestering. In some of these other ones, it's quite a bit more difficult, right? So if you're just putting rocks on a beach, there's a question of, well, how fast do the rocks react with CO2? What percentage of them react? How long does it take, right? And so there's a much more complicated measurement process there. Same thing with some of these biogenic solutions, is that they're a bit more complicated to measure. What's developing in these spaces, which is very similar to what's done in energy efficiency already, it's what's already done in pretty much any industry that has a diligence process, is you have an independent company that provides measurement, reporting, and verification. And so what they do is they come in, look at the process, take their own measurements, do their own analysis, and confirm that there are actually removals happening. So in the case of something like biochar, if a biochar company were trying to sell carbon credits and do that on a large scale, they would, in order to sell their credits into a registry, and the registries have thresholds for what they will accept, that biochar company would need to have some kind of independent verification company come in and say, yep, they actually did it. Now you can sell those credits to a registry, and so that the people in the registry have confidence that the removals actually occurred.
So you don't think it'll be a government inspection? It'll be a private company inspection?
I think it depends on who's buying. So right now, most of the purchasing of credits is happening from private companies. So what's really driving the market with carbon dioxide removal right now is, some of the more aggressive companies, and they turn out to be some tech companies, that are putting up money to buy carbon dioxide removal credits because they want to offset their own emissions. And that's okay to get the market started, but if CDR is going to get to the scale that I showed here that we think is needed in order to hit our long-term climate goals, there will need to be a transition to where the government is either requiring companies or people who are emitting CO2 to pay for their own waste cleanup, or to pay for some kind of retroactive waste cleanup. And when that happens, Sandy, I think to answer this question is like, when that happens, you would probably have the government doing its own form of verification on where removals are happening, if they're happening at scale. Right now, because it's private companies doing the purchasing, they're going to require verification simply to cover their own purchases. So it's happening through independent markets now, but like I said, I think if it gets to a larger scale, it certainly could be the government doing those kinds of verifications.
And then Diane is it Deanne? Deanne is worried about what will happen if the administration changes.
Yeah, that's a great question. I just wanted to add, I want to answer that question, but I also wanted to add something to what Rudy was saying. I think one role for government to play is to set the rules for how we count, basically establish the standards for how we count the emissions or the amount of removals that are happening. And then third-party companies can sort of verify against those rules. So that's a potential role that we think is going to be important for a government to play, even if the government's not buying the removals themselves, because that allows everybody to trust that Joe, the company A in Washington State that's doing CDR is following the same rules that company B in Colorado is following. And so it allows the market to be much more efficient. But to the question about changes in administration, we talk about this a lot in the U.S. program at RMI. It's certainly a concern. We talk a lot these days about how do we defend all of the big wins that have happened under the Biden administration. One of the things that we really try to do as much as we can is highlight how much the Inflation Reduction Act and the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and all of these different incentives and funding packages have actually benefited red states way more than blue states. So a lot of the clean energy projects, and the carbon management projects and the clean hydrogen projects, you all probably heard about, talked about that as well. A lot of these projects are happening in Republican districts and in Republican dominated states. And so there's no sort of ironclad way to guarantee that these incentives and new programs don't get reversed under a new administration. But probably our most powerful tool is around storytelling and highlighting how these projects are benefiting people in the communities that are served by Republican representatives.
Thank you. Alice wanted to know about the Pueblo carbon capture problem. Do you know anything about it?
So I'm trying to remember the exact name. I think it's sort of generic that it's the Colorado Regional Direct Air Capture Hub. This was one of the consortiums that was awarded funding through the Department of Energy under the Direct Air Capture Hub program recently. That project is looking at Pueblo to site the Direct Air Capture Hub. That might be just one piece of what companies are looking at doing in Pueblo, because you're right, Alice, that where there is a large amount of industry, and also storage locations that are feasible, it's going to be attractive to project developers. I don't know the really intimate details of how the process is going with communities. I will say, just from what I've read in terms of public information, so a lot of the projects that are in development, they're very protective of their plans because it's a competition, it's business. And RMI is the same way in some of its projects that we're leading in other states. But so I don't know much about the Direct Air Capture Hub that's happening and that's proposed to happen in Pueblo. But I do know that what I've seen of it, they have not mentioned anything about how they're working with communities to to assess the feasibility of these projects. And I think that that's going to be, I can't say that they're not doing it because I'm not on the inside, but that's going to be a death sentence for these big industrial projects that are trying to site in these communities that have historically been really disproportionately impacted by pollution. It's really a shame because there's some possibility, there's an opportunity to clean up some of the emissions that are harming these communities through these projects. But if you don't bring the communities along with you, they're not going to welcome it. And we think, we believe that it's incredibly important to design these projects with communities in mind and tell that, and give them a meaningful voice at the table.
Carolyn wants to know if there are any processes to create a product for the sugar that carbon dioxide turns into in plants.
Yeah, so there are several processes that look at using plant-based sugars to make other fuels, and in doing so also produce a stream of CO2 that can be sequestered. So the most famous one of those is production of corn-based ethanol, right? Which you can also produce with sugarcane sugar as well. So if you take sugar from a plant and ferment it into ethanol, you not only get ethanol as a fuel that you can use, but you actually also produce CO2 from the fermentation process. So if any of you ever, have been around someone that brewed their own beer or something like that, right? You get the bubbles and the CO2 comes off of it, right? And so you can actually capture that and then sequester it and store some of that CO2. Of course, when the ethanol is burned, some of the CO2 is also going back into the atmosphere. So it's not fully a removal pathway. But that's one of the ways in which CO2 removal is already happening.
And are there other ways that they're doing that?
So, I would say that's,
about?
that's the main way of using sugars from plants as a process input, is converting them into fuels. For the most part, when you're looking at the total amount of carbon that's in a plant, very little of it is actually the sugar, right? And so there's a lot more of the plant that's like the stalk and all the lignin, and it's like the material that makes the plant a plant, right? The sugar is a small piece of it. So really, when we're looking at carbon dioxide removal, we're trying to think about what we can do with the whole plant because there's so much carbon in the rest of it.
Apparently, Al Gore this morning said something about these approaches not providing a rationale for not transitioning away from oil and gas.
Yeah.
Have any comment for that?
Yeah, so this was the comment that I made at the end of my little section. And, I can pull that back up again, but it was this piece that I said about mitigation coming first. And I think what Al Gore is objecting to, let me share screen again. So can you all see this again?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so this slide, right? So what Al Gore is basically saying is like, oh, you're telling me that you have this retroactive waste cleanup that people can use in the future to just clean up all their waste? That just sounds to me like a free pass to not do anything today, right? And what Al Gore, I think, is objecting to is he's saying this is really a dangerous thing because it's going to make people complacent about the real pressure today of what needs to be done to mitigate emissions. But as I showed you all, in one of my very first slides, is like, we're not going to get to where we need to go unless we mitigate a lot today and then also do removals later, right? And so the truth is we need both mitigation and removals. And so that was my comment about CDR being necessary but not sufficient. And Al Gore is saying basically the same thing, but he's saying don't get distracted by CDR because we need to be focused on, reducing emissions today. And what we're saying is like, absolutely, we need to be focused on that. But when 2050 hits, we need to have developed carbon dioxide removal as well, because it's going to be too late to start then, right? And so we need to start thinking about these approaches as well. as a way to remove, these two pieces here that we put on the left, right? So to remove the emissions from the past, and then also to clean up emissions that are just really difficult to fully get rid of even in 2050.
So that would answer the question about from Gail about how much thought is being done to natural solutions like trees and regenerative agriculture. That's part of it, right? Mm-hmm. How do you sequester CO2 and how is it transported to injection sites?
Yeah. Yeah, so I can comment on this briefly. So CO2 has been injected underground for decades. The oil and gas industry has been doing this since the 60s. And as Kyle said, it's often done in similar geologic formations as where oil and gas is pulled out of the ground. So that's cool because we already know how to do it. And it turns out that the Earth actually has a lot of space underground. Just in terms of all of the strata of rock and the structures that are under the Earth, we could sequester many, many times more than the total CO2 humans have ever released easily, right? Like hundreds of times more CO2. So there's plenty of space under the Earth to actually sequester all the CO2. It's just a question of developing the wells to do it. In terms of transport, currently it's done, mostly the capture and sequestration is done all on the same site. And so you aren't really moving CO2 very far. But if we were to get to the kind of scale that we're, showing here, there would inevitably be the development of transportation pipelines, similar to the way other materials are transported.
And pipelines is one of the things that I hear a lot of worries about.
Yeah.
Is there a problem with like explosions and stuff like that with CO2?
No, so CO2 is actually as inert as you can get for carbon, so you can't burn it. Because it's already been burned, right? It was a fossil fuel or it was a plant, and when you burned it, it became CO2, which is an inert substance. There are other safety concerns with CO2, and so leaking is certainly not good. But essentially, if it were to leak out, it would just go back into the atmosphere, which is where it came from in the first place.
Yeah, and I would just add that, there, like Rudy said, the oil and gas industry has been sequestering CO2 for decades. In the same way, we've been moving CO2 around for decades and doing it, all things considered, quite safely. There was one incident a few years ago where there was a CO2 pipeline that leaked. And when it happens, it is a serious issue because carbon dioxide by itself is heavier than the surrounding air. So while it's leaking out and until it mixes with the surrounding air, it's going to settle at the ground level. And that can be really dangerous to human health and animal health and things like that. And so it's certainly not a non-issue. We need to make sure that there are really rigorous regulations protecting against that. I think we need to make CO2 smell. Natural gas doesn't smell by itself. It has a fragrance added to it when it's put into the distribution system. And so I think we need to do the same with carbon dioxide. But the bottom line is, like, we can do it very safely, and to the extent that we can put carbon dioxide removal projects right next to the well, that's better. It's cheaper, it's safer, it wins on every level. But I think it's probably inevitable given the scale that we'll need that transport infrastructure.
Yep. I apologize.
Okay,
I'm gonna have to drop. But yep. Tyler, you able to stay?
Yeah, I can stay for just a few more minutes.
Okay. There was a question about mini earthquakes. Thank you for coming to our seminar.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for the opportunity. All right.
Thanks. So I'm not a geologist, but I will say that the geologists that I work with recognize that they're like similar to leaking pipelines, carbon dioxide pipelines. This is not a non-issue. It's not a total red herring, but we do have a really deep and sort of decades-long understanding of how geology works underground, and so we certainly need that managing for potential seismic activity is really important, but but it is a manageable problem or a manageable issue with the right regulations and policy in place.
Ann Sutton asked about the oil and gas industry using CO2 for oil recovery. Will that be something that will happen?
So it is happening.
Yeah, I mean,
It's happening.
what's going to continue?
It is happening. It's happening in Colorado, or has happened in the past in Colorado. But I will say, and I think that it's likely to continue happening for quite some time. However, there are, a lot of policies, a lot of, funding incentives and things like that, either give less money to projects that are doing enhanced oil recovery because they're getting something out of it. They don't need as much of a subsidy, or they completely restrict enhanced oil recovery projects from receiving funding. And so that's certainly something that I know the state of Colorado is considering, in their carbon management roadmap that was mandated in a piece of legislation last year. They are looking at, they want to consider whether or not enhanced oil recovery should be an eligible type of project. My 2 cents, and this may be controversial, is that as long as we are consuming oil will be extracted and sold. And so while enhanced oil recovery is it feels icky, just to put it really I don't like it either. But in reality, the thing that is driving the oil out of the ground is me driving to the mall or the grocery store, or me taking a flight to Washington, D.C. for some meetings or something like that. So we need policy to continue to help us to wean ourselves off of oil. And that's not to say that it's like an individual problem. That's what oil and gas companies love to do, is they love to push the problem off onto the individual. It's not the individual, it's our systems, but it's the systems of consumption rather the systems of supply, because no company is going to supply something that's not in demand. And so as long as we demand it, oil is going to come out of the ground. And so we need to work at it from that end, just as much as anything else. I don't disagree with you, Ann. I think, if for no other reason, then they're getting something out of it. They're getting the oil out, and in a lot of cases, they have to push the CO2 underground to get the oil out. So they're profiting. They shouldn't get subsidies for something that they're making money off of.
Okay, so you answered that last question. There was one before that. This will be our last question. Can you recap what energy sources are projected through 2050 to power CDR?
So it's going to really depend on our electricity system. There are some forms of CDR that require heat. And so for that, you could burn natural gas. There are some CDR companies that are doing that, but you could also use electric heat. You could use clean hydrogen, and things like that. We believe that the CDR approaches that require energy, or like significant amounts of energy, we think we're probably better off if we move towards the approaches that can use clean electricity, because then we can, one, that means that every ton that's captured through that process, it's more efficient because you're not emitting greenhouse gases in the process of capturing the greenhouse gas. And two, it's likely to be more efficient if it can be electrified. Now I will say, Rudy presented those 30 approaches. Some of those approaches, the actual process of storing the CO2 doesn't actually use electricity. It's rocks reacting with air and water around it, or it's trees growing, or taking waste biomass and sinking it into the ocean where it won't decompose. Now all of these things need to be vetted and proved, and we need to figure out if we can do it at scale and do it safely. But there are a lot of approaches that don't require electricity inherently, but will require energy to, say, transport the biomass from point A to point B where it's going to be stored. And so that's where, where we go back to, like, how are we also in parallel transitioning the systems around us, not just electricity, but also transportation and things like that.
Well, thank you very much for this. This has been very enlightening. I hope everyone enjoyed it. And Barbara, did you have something? Was your hand up? Bob Dundee? No. Okay. So thank you for doing this, and Alice, thank you for setting this up for us. This has been very good.
Yeah, thank you.
See you guys next month.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks much.